Speaking of which, the news. So this particular slide has three different articles from the New York Times in this period of like the last 2 to 3 years. So we're getting like early COVID days into 2023 is late 2023, I think is one of my latest articles. But you can see the discussion of, museums vote to allow the sale of art, and it does specify for care of collections, so that's nice. But for reasons we'll get into in a second, that was like a huge difference from what it used to be, because it used to only be allowed where you could sell art, but for the specific acquisition of just other different art. So to be able to sell art, to just care for the collections as the remaining exist, was a huge shift for the field. Not that the public knows that. Selling art to pay the bills divides the nation's museum directors. And so they're referring to the Association of Art Museum Directors, AAMD, and their policies in terms of whether you can sell and deaccession art and what can you do with those proceeds. It used to just be collect more art. This, because of COVID, changed due to hardship and needing to be able to have flexibility on where that money goes, etc. And then to our last headline over here on the right, 2 museums tried to sell art. Only one caught grief about it. So as you look at it and as you're hearing some of these stories where one was able to sell art, no problem, no scandal, another one seemingly doing the same thing, different, got lots of grief about it. And then this case, the Baltimore Museum of Art ended up pulling the art from the, I think, Sotheby's auction, like in the 11th hour. So it's just a smattering of New York Times articles. So we could do a whole other webinar on the controversy of selling art, and I would love to do that. So maybe we'll do that later in the year. But just to touch on it briefly here, since it could be an avenue of disposal for you, this is why it's controversial. First and foremost, the collections that we have are seen as existing purely for the public good. So museums and archives, the reason we exist in like a ethereal way, not in like a literal way, is because we are here to collect and preserve things, history, art, and culture, not for us, but for the public. And so all of those collections are considered under the public trust and are for the public good. And again, this is not written down anywhere as a formal law, nor is it necessarily something that could be enforced in a legal way. And yet that is the predominant, like, universal understanding and agreement that we have all made with each other. That impacts public trust, not in a different from the art is a public for the public trust, and different, and is like the public trusting museums as an institution and trusting them to do the right thing, trusting them to take care of items, trusting museums and archives to share histories in a responsible way. So the public controversy of selling is that it shakes that trust that the public has in us as institutions. Additionally, it can very much look like, and in some cases can be, the literal definition of cannibalizing the collection. So depending on what it is that's being deaccessioned, depending on selling it, but for what purpose, where will those proceeds go? Is that deemed acceptable both by the larger museum field as well as the general public? And it can seem like an unsustainable and distasteful action of picking apart parts of your collection to the overall detriment in order to take care of some of the other parts of your collection. Another controversial reason is that it could be fiduciary irresponsibility, specifically and in most cases from the boards. And for many of the headlines of scandalous art sales, usually it's scandalous because there's some sort of insinuation that the board member is selling this piece of art because they want to acquire this other piece of art because they're friends with the artist or something. So it can seem irresponsible from like there's a favoritism and decisions made not based on policy. It can also seem like irresponsibility because the job of the board is to help take care of the museum in a financial sense and guide them to be financially responsible and successful. And if they're selling the collection to help that, and getting into our next point, you can't continue to sell the collection and have that money go to museum operations, because at some point you will run out of collections to sell to keep the museum operational. And so if the board is not being responsible with the money for the museum, it can lead to unsustainable sales to help shore up operations, which asterisk is probably one of the reasons that the policy, according to American Alliance of Museums, as co-signed by the Art Association of Museum Directors, that the sales should never go to operations. Like there was some brief flexibility during COVID, but it's not, your sales can't go to operations. They can't stop you necessarily, not in a legal sense, but they will definitely, there's sanctions that can happen if you do that would prevent some of your other museum operations from happening if you make that choice. And finally, museums exist to sustain art, not the reverse. And so again, this public and more ethereal concept of that art, history, culture, whatever it is in your museum and archives collections exists. Your institution exists to take care of those collections, not the museum and archives exists to sell the collections. So it it seems like you're doing something that is not even part of the job description in a way, in terms of getting rid of the collections.